And so I thought for today, I'm going to give a rather broad programmatic talk that hopefully links to quite a few of the topics that we've discussed over the last few days. And so it links also a bit to my own kind of intellectual development of interest. I started as a very mainstream philosopher of science, working on issues of natural kinds, ontological choices, pluralism. We've heard a lot of that. And in the past few years, I've kind of moved more into domains of thinking about science in a messy world. Like, how do we think about the role of science in times of climate change, of biodiversity loss, of deep social economic inequalities? How is science in part complicit in producing these problems, while at the same time also indispensable in addressing those problems? But in many ways, those topics are connected, right? And so today I want to focus on one of these connections, namely when we're navigating a messy world, we classify it, or we develop conceptual apparatuses of science and navigating the world we're encountering. Of course, all these questions of ontological plurality, of natural kinds, and so come back. And so I'm particularly interested in the types of concepts that scientists use, sometimes for a long time, sometimes they're kind of more recently invented concepts of scientists, and navigating the kind of the messy world that we're encountering. So just a few rather random examples of the kind of concepts that I have in mind: the Anthropocene, biocultural diversity, circular economy, ecosystem services, genetically modified organism, genocide, indigeneity, neoliberalism, neurodiversity, sustainability, terrorism, whiteness, right? So those are concepts that have come, of course, from a wide range of different fields, from kind of ecology to economy to social sciences to health sciences and so on. And so the main point that I want to make, well, actually it's 2 points, right? So there's a critical point, wanting to argue that the way how philosophy of science and also analytic metaphysics has thought about concepts and classifications primarily through what I call the natural-non-natural divide, has been deeply unhelpful for making sense of these types of concepts. In many ways, I think a lot of philosophers have simply ignored those concepts and not engaged with them. And then when they start to engage with them, with the kind of conceptual apparatus that they have in terms of natural kinds debates, they've often created more confusion than clarity in doing that. But so I don't just want to be critical, I also want to say something constructive. And I do think that actually the way how current philosophy of science is developing in debates about scientific classification, there are actually quite a lot of interesting insights that kind of open up new horizons for different ways of engaging with these types of kind of complex and contested questions that we encounter when doing science in a messy world. So that's the overall program. And I do think, I will not get into too much detail in that this is actually something that where philosophers kind of can meet the demand that they encounter in actual scientific practices. So those are just kind of a few random papers that have been recently published in a wide different range of fields. So on the left, a paper called Conceptual Innovation and Environmental Policy, on the kind of need of kind of rethinking the conceptual apparatus for environmental policy. And on the bottom left, Fractures in the Framework, Limitations of Classification System in Psychiatry. We've heard a bit about that already, like questions of how do we think about like psychological concepts and psychiatric concepts in intercultural contexts, for example. Questions of how we think about the concepts of toxicology, how we think about agricultural concepts with kind of new movements like agroecology or sustainable agriculture. And of course I could mention many more kind of fields, for example, from the social sciences. So all of these kind of fields that are, of course, evolving, that are encountering new challenges, that are engaging with kind of complex socio-ecological realities, that are coming up with new concepts. And I do think as philosophers, we should be able to engage with these developments, and we should have something interesting to say about that, right? And so that's kind of the overall project. But so I think for today, well, like tomorrow I give another talk, and so that will be a bit more practically oriented. Today I will kind of go back to some of the kind of more fundamental philosophical questions kind of that lay in the background. And so I want to start with what I want to call the natural, non-natural divide. Kind of the tradition of natural kinds, as it's also sometimes called, thinking about the way how scientists use concepts in terms of naturalness. And so I wanted to start I think many of you, of course, are familiar with the concept of natural kinds, but I thought it may still be helpful for the audience to kind of motivate that concept in the first place before discussing what the problems are with the way it's been set up. And so I think we can all agree that language is a very kind of creative practice, right? So we constantly invent and modify our concepts. Right? There's also no language police that can stop us from doing so, right? So scientists constantly kind of come up with new concepts like the Anthropocene. Philosophers discuss how should we shape and invent concepts, like there's a whole field of conceptual engineering, for example, that many of you are familiar with, right? And so in many ways, the concepts that we use depend on us and our creativity. Right? Now, the idea of natural kinds kind of comes in as the observation that even if we as humans are the ones who come up with the concepts, not all concepts are the same. And in many ways, the success of concepts depends on the way how they capture reality. Right? And so naturalness is often used by philosophers to kind of capture that intuition that some concepts kind of represent or capture or relate to reality kind of more successfully than others, right? So think, again, of the concept of the Anthropocene that's been proposed something like 10, 15 years ago, I think, right? It's kind of a new geological epoch, like an epoch that is characterized by human intervention, right? And sure, that's a human intervention. It's itself a human invention, that new concept, right? But whether we should or should not use that concept depends on reality in many ways, right? And so there's, in the geology community, there's been kind of a huge debate whether that concept makes sense or not. Actually, right now, it's been by the kind of bigger society bodies not accepted. So, to give a bit more clarity to that idea, I wanted to kind of have a little example, right? So I came up with a concept called dominance for the purposes of this presentation. Right? And that's animals that David likes, right? And then there are other concepts of animals, like jaguar, that scientists actually use, right? And the way how the kind of traditional natural, non-natural divide would work is to say, well, the one on the left, jaguar, is a natural kind, Davimals is a non-natural kind, right? That's just something that I came up with. And you can kind of spell out that intuition by thinking about how would research on Davimals look like compared to how it would research on jaguars look like, right? You can have a scientist who's studying jaguars, right? And they can discover all kinds of new things about jaguars, right? About their behavior, about their anatomy, about their evolution, about their ecological role, and so on, right? In contrast, there is not really like a feasible research project on Davimals, right? Because they don't have similar anatomies, as you can see, because I do like the kind of Mandarin ducks, but I also kind of like the sloth, and they have very different types of anatomies. They also have very different evolutionary histories. They behave in very different ways. So they're not similar in ways that would allow us to kind of develop interesting research. They don't have enough in common, right? And so the tradition of natural kinds is basically the idea to say, well, science often works by identifying these natural kinds that have a lot of stuff in common where you can develop productive research agendas. And they have to be distinguished from the kind of arbitrary concepts like Darwin's that we just come up with, but that don't represent anything kind of fundamental reality, right? And so the way it's been kind of traditionally constructed is that on the one hand we have the natural kinds that are, in the words of the philosopher David Lewis, an elite minority, right? And then we have all the rest that's not natural. And that kind of natural elite minority has been often imagined to exist mind independently, right? So a species like jaguar is discovered in the wild by biologists or by people, right? It's not made up by people. Well, I can be made up Darwinists, right? So only the natural kinds exist independently from our minds, right? They're also assumed to be value-free, right? Like what counts as a jaguar or not depends on the structure of the world, because all of those similarities that jaguars have and that distinguish them from lions or other animals, right? Well, the extension of Darwin modes is clearly value-dependent, right? So if a sloth hurts my feelings and I stop liking sloths, the extension of Darwin modes changes, right? So clearly that's dependent on my values, right? And often also philosophers have imagined these natural kinds to be kind of defined by essences, structures that kind of bind them together, right? So if you think classical example, like in chemistry, water, right? Like all instances of water have the same chemical structure, H2O, right? And again, Darwin modes are widely diverse, they don't have essence. So that's how a lot of philosophy of science and analytic philosophy has been operating and thinking about concepts and classifications, that there are these kind of natural kinds out there in the world that are mind-independent, value-free essences. That's why science is successful, and as philosophers we try to kind of theorize them. Now, the problems with that divide are kind of, I think, many. There's not just one. But I think one thing that is fair to say is that traditional way of thinking about concepts and classifications in science has been in crisis for quite a few decades. And the critiques that have been leveled against that type of making kind of a division between the natural and the non-natural kind of goes across all these kind of different characteristics that I've just mentioned as kind of supposedly characterizing natural kinds. Well, first of all, many serious scientific kinds, they're clearly not mind-independent, right? I mean, most obviously, if you work in philosophy of psychology, psychological states are not mind-independent, right? But also, a lot of that applies to, if you think about philosophy of social sciences, our social institutions are not mind-independent, right? And it's very awkward anyway to call social kinds natural kinds, right? So a lot of the kind of traditional divide between the natural and the non-natural is fundamentally kind of unequipped to, I think, do proper philosophy of social sciences. But similar things also happen in engineering sciences. If you think of artifacts, are clearly not mind-independent, right? If you want to kind of theorize kinds of machines, say philosophy of AI. But it also happens even in the life sciences, right? Like humans have a huge effect on biodiversity, whether it's traditional plant breeding or genetic modification. A lot of the biodiversity that we encounter in our daily lives is clearly not mind-independent, it's shaped by this, right? So the idea that serious scientific kinds somehow are mind-independent does not work, right? You've heard quite a bit on what I had said before on kind of ontological choices and value freedom. But I do think it's been pretty well established that a lot of scientific kinds are also not value-free, right? They are shaped by our epistemic and non-epistemic values in doing science. And so to stick with kind of, as I brought the jaguar as an example of biology, a lot of philosophers of biology do not think anymore that we just discover species in the world, because there are many different ways of operationalizing what counts as a species, right? And for one purpose, it may make more sense to operationalize the concept of species in one way, and for another purpose, you do it in another way. And you sometimes encounter that more in terms of different epistemic values. Let's say a paleontologist may use a different species concept than an evolutionary biologist, and so they have different explanatory goals, so they use the concept in different ways. But there are also often very direct kind of social, non-epistemic influences on how we use species concepts, right? Like one of the big questions right now is like what species concept will help us best in addressing conservation purposes, right? And there are some species concepts that kind of lead to a much larger number of species that increase the conservation pressure, but also make them subpopulations kind of more visible to policymakers, right? And there are other species concepts that have less species as a result, right? So those kind of non-epistemic values play a big role in what kind of, how we kind of shape concepts of species. And I think similar things are true for a lot of concepts in both natural and social sciences. And then I think the thing that's probably most uncontroversial at this point, most, or maybe even all scientific concepts don't have essences as they were kind of traditionally conceived, right? So the idea is that, you know, you have things that kind of look the same, and then you put them in the laboratory, they all have the same microstructure, right? Like in the way of water, all cases of water have the structure of 2HO. That doesn't work in a lot of fields, and it certainly doesn't work in the life sciences, right? It's not like you can define biological species by saying everyone has the same kind of genetic code, right? Because the way how genetic diversity within a species works is just too complex to kind of define a shared common essence. So basically all the characteristics that have been traditionally assumed to sustain the divide between the natural concepts and the non-natural concepts have been widely challenged in the literature. And so then the question is, what do we do with that? And so there is a large body of literature that tries to kind of reformulate the concept of natural kinds in a way that it can do without assumptions of value, freedom, essence, mind, independence, right? And so they point out things like, well, even if you don't have those things, like all instances of natural kind, like a jaguar, they share certain properties, and they're causally unified by sharing, for example, kind of the same evolutionary history. They're projectable in the sense, like you know, like an entity as a jaguar, you can make inductive generalizations about how it will behave, how its anatomical structure will be, and so on. They're kind of in some way grounded in the world, they're functional for scientific purposes, and so on. Right? So there are attempts to kind of reformulate a more liberal notion of natural kinds that doesn't come with these like very heavy kind of metaphysical commitments. And then there's another kind of way of reacting to it, of saying, well, let's just get rid of that concept, right? And so that's been kind of my attitude for a while, where, well, in a more kind of nuanced explanation of saying, well, we can think about all the kind of interesting epistemic and metaphysical features of concepts, like the projectability, how they kind of involve kind of clusters of related properties, and so on, without ever using the term natural kind. And as that concept has such a long, kind of heavy metaphysical baggage with it, maybe we're doing better in theorizing these things without the term, right? Now, a lot of my colleagues don't like that, right? And so I guess, you know, one of the benefits of saying wild things is that people will disagree with you, and so there's been quite a bit of pushback against me taking away the lovely concept of natural kinds from philosophy of science. And so we've had kind of a larger debate that I don't have time to kind of rehearse. I don't think in the end what I'm suggesting is that wild, right? Because I think sometimes when people hear, oh, let's let go of natural kinds, let's abandon the tradition of natural kinds, they think that the alternative is some kind of anything goes relativism. Now that nothing is natural anymore, you can just kind of do whatever you want, right? And there's like nothing that grounds concepts in the world anymore. I mean, that's not really what I meant to say. The point was more that a lot of these things that kind of these reformed natural kind proposals are pointing out, right? Like there's still inductive generalizations, there's still grounding of concepts and empirical discoveries about how properties are clustered and all of those. Those are all relevant insights, right? But they don't require us to use the notion of natural kinds that I think has very different associations and kind of suggests like a simple divide in a way that is deeply misleading, right? So let's just focus on these kind of things more directly, like on the property clustering, on the projectability and so on, rather than trying to kind of distinguish our concepts into natural ones and non-natural ones, right? So I think the state of that debate is that it's, I think, still unresolved. There are some people like me who want to get rid of the concept. There are other people who want to kind of save the concept by reformulating it. And in some ways, that's a fun kind of philosophical debate to have. In other ways, and that's kind of where I want to kind of shift to the more constructive thing, maybe it's not the most important question, actually, right? Whether we use the term natural kind or we don't use the term of natural kind is in the end, I think, more a terminological question. And what most people in the debate say is, I think, actually shows a quite deep agreement on how we should think about scientific concepts kind of in a more pluralist way, no matter whether we use that term or not. And so that's where I want to kind of get to the last part of the talk, the kind of new horizons of how to think about scientific concepts and scientific classifications beyond the natural and unnatural. And so to kind of look at the broader picture first again, I've suggested that the tradition of natural kinds and the kind of idea that we're dividing our concepts into the proper scientific ones that are natural and then the folk ones or the kind of dysfunctional ones that are non-natural, has made philosophers obsess with like a very, very narrow subset of case studies, right? Because they were looking for good case studies of natural kinds. So they all talked about water and chemical elements and physical particles, and that's basically it, right? And so I think it has, in a way, made philosophers deeply detached from the reality of scientific practice. Because the vast majority of concepts in science do not fit that kind of characterization, right? And so this focus on what Lewis called the elite minority may have worked for kind of certain metaphysical problems that the metaphysicians of philosophy of science wanted to address, right? But it has very little use for the kind of context that I started with, right? Scientists engaging with a messy world, coming up with concepts like ecosystem services or the Anthropocene or whatever, trying to kind of figure out how to conceptually make sense of the complexity that they encounter. And so, no matter whether we use a more liberal, reformulated notion of natural kind, or we just kind of get rid of the term, I think the current debates point towards the fact that that simple divide between the natural and non-natural does not work, right? And that a lot of the actual philosophical challenges are to make sense of the concepts that are in between kind of classical natural kinds and purely arbitrary kinds. The kind of concepts that are in some ways grounded in the world, that have some epistemic functions, but also have social functions that clearly are politically contested, but that don't reduce to just purely political things, right? So that kind of messiness is something that I think we need to engage with in order to kind of make sense of scientific concepts in a way that does justice to the reality of scientific practices that we encounter. Right? And I do think we can use both some of those kind of liberal accounts of natural kinds, as well as kind of my own more eliminativist approach to kind of do that type of work. So I do think that is something that we share. And so I want to kind of to conclude, briefly outline 3 different horizons in where I think we can kind of have interesting new debates, we can kind of make new insights, and we can connect philosophical reasoning with scientific practices in more productive ways. And so it's going to be metaphysics, epistemology, politics, right? And so first, metaphysics, right? So most scientific concepts are not simply discovered in the world the way that natural kind theorists assume, right? But they're also not purely arbitrary linguistic constructions, right? As kind of a purely relativistic concept, right? And this is especially salient for the kind of concepts that I started with, that I think we kind of need to think through for kind of making sense of socio-ecological crises, right? And so I think we need a kind of more nuanced metaphysics, right? And I think some of the things that have kind of come out in recent debates, both of people who use and people who don't use the notion of natural kinds, are including these kind of 3 points. A lot of these concepts are, on the one hand, deeply political, but they're also still constrained by our empirical knowledge about the world, right? So, for example, genetically modified organism as a concept, it is deeply political what does or does not belong to that concept, right? Because not all forms of human modification of living organisms, like traditional plant breeding, does not count as genetic modification, right? But there's no kind of objective way of where you cut the line at what point something counts as a genetic modification, right? But it has massive regulatory impact, right, where we cut the line. For example, in the European Union right now, it's very, very contested because gene editing has been originally kind of classified as a form of genetic modification. Big industry backlash about Europe falling behind against the rest of the world in terms of kind of agricultural innovations. That kind of led to a revision of that law, right? So it's deeply contested and deeply political where we draw the line, like what type of our engagement with living organisms counts as genetic modification, right? But at the same time, it's not just arbitrary, right? Obviously, there are a lot of kind of very material things about genetic modification, the kind of technologies, like the kind of impact that it has both in genotypes and phenotypes, right? So we need to kind of think both in terms of what does empirically make sense in kind of defining a concept, right? But also what does make political sense. Second point, quite a few of these concepts that I've started with, they're hybrid in the sense that they involve properties that are investigated by different scientific fields, sometimes biological and social sciences at the same time, right? Think of a concept like whiteness or any other type of racial category, right? It's one of the, and we started with that, right? So one of the things that makes racial ontologies so complex, right, is that they involve references, or at least kind of suggest references, to vastly different things, right? Like, for example, colonial oppression and white supremacy, but also different phenotypes and kind of different genetic markers, right? And so these things are not easy to think through in the tradition of natural kinds, where we thought there was like just one clear referent that the concept will kind of attach to. A lot of these concepts are interactive, right, in the sense that they're describing the world, right? But at the same time, they're also performative in the way that they change the world, right? So think of a concept like neurodiversity, right? In some ways, it's a descriptive concept, right? Meant as like a broad concept to describe people whose kind of cognitive functions are different from kind of the neurotypical way, right? At the same time, bringing that concept in, right, is also an attempt to kind of change our relations to different types of cognitive behavior, right? So it's also kind of a performative function that people use to kind of change how we engage with the world, right? And so there's some literature, some of you may know these kind of looping effect debates of Ian hacking, right? Like people who start being classified in certain ways, they start behaving because they're classified in certain ways, right? And so we need to think about these kind of interactive dynamics, right? So the point is here that there's like a lot of metaphysical work, I think, that can be done once we're kind of moved past that kind of simple divide of trying to sort our concepts in being either natural or non-natural. Right? I think the same counts on the epistemological side. So the tradition of natural kinds has an epistemic dimension, always had one, right? So in some ways, natural kinds are imagined in metaphysical ways as kind of the concept that kind of identify these kind of mind-independent objective structures and realities. But that has always been kind of combined with the epistemic claim that they are useful that because they refer real structures, right? We can use them for inductive generalizations and projectability, right? So you know that X is a jaguar, right? You can infer that X will be dangerous for you, right? You can infer that it is a mammal. You can infer that it has a tail. You can infer that it is a big cat. You can infer that it has stripes, and so on and so on, right? So that type of epistemic function of natural kinds has always been part of the tradition. But that's basically it, right? And whatever other epistemic and non-epistemic functions our scientific concepts may have has been rarely discussed and often actively obscured by the way we've been discussing natural kinds. And so first, I think that involves the different kinds of epistemic functions that concepts can have, right? Of course, scientific concepts can allow inductive generalizations, but they do a lot of other things, right? So for example, they serve agenda setting purposes in research, right? So to return to the concept of the Anthropocene again, right, you can think, is that kind of a proper geological term that will allow us kind of inductive inferences, right, in terms of that geological epoch. But I think the reason why that concept has blown up so much in kind of the scientific community is because it set a new agenda, right? For us to kind of think about the structure of geology, but more broadly planetary structure in terms of human intervention, right? And it's mostly that epistemic function of a gender setting rather than its kind of inductive inferences that made that concept so successful in the past, right? And it is also, I think, often that the tradition of natural kinds has blinded us to the many non-epistemic functions that our concepts, scientific or otherwise, may have, right? And there's also a lot, I think, of kind of social epistemology that we need to do in that, right? So I think of another contested concept, the concept of woman, right? And of course I'm thinking in part about all the contestations about trans people, right? And or trans women, right? And you can think of that in part in terms of projectability and inductive inferences, right? Like if we include trans women in the category of women, we can make some kind of generalizations, like for example about their identity, about the way how they will dress, the way how they will kind of behave in certain contexts and so on, right? But we will not be able to make other inferences, for example, about their internal kind of anatomical structure, right? if we use the concept of woman in a way that includes trans women, it's the other way around, right? And so, of course, we could have a debate about like which one is kind of epistemically more productive or not, right? But in many ways, I think that would misrepresent the debate, right? Because it would not get to the point that a lot of that debate is about kind of what kind of world do we want to create for trans people, right? Do we want to create a world where trans women have access to the women's bathroom or not, right? And those are kind of political normative implications of our conceptual practices that do not reduce to the question of like what's the kind of inductive power of concept, right? So I do think that there's a huge space for us to develop a more complex social epistemology of scientific concepts, right, and scientific kinds, that reaches beyond the kind of epistemic questions that have been traditionally discussed within that kind of natural and unnatural divide. And so finally, kind of leading over from the kind of social epistemology, I do think that there are also kind of new political horizons, right, of us thinking about what is the politics of our concept range. And I do think that a lot of late 20th century philosophy has not been very helpful for us, for us to kind of make sense of the politics of concepts, especially if we want to have actual impact on, for example, science policy. And I think it's in part a legacy of the analytic continental divide. I think it's in part the legacy of kind of different kind of philosophical sub-communities developing different kind of paradigms that they kind of presented and kind of clashed towards each other. But in a way, I think my overall diagnosis is that the tradition of natural kinds of philosophy of science and analytic philosophy has often led to a deep depoliticization of concepts, right? Because all the parts that directly related to societal impact, right, were considered as irrelevant for determining their naturalness, right? And so I think that's, for example, it has been a huge problem in analytic philosophers kind of jumping on the metaphysics of gender and race, of just kind of applying the tools that they used to have in discussing jaguars and water, right? And assuming that they can discuss gender and race in the same ways, often kind of cutting out some of the kind of most salient performative political parts of how these concepts operate, right? But I don't think it's only the analytics that I should blame there, right? I do think there's something like there's been kind of a similar narrowing down happening more on the post-structuralist side of the debates, right? Where indeed that tradition very much focused on the politics of the concepts, right? And it became all about how scientific or other concepts are used as tools of power, of control, of domination, and so on, right? But a lot of scientific concepts do not just reduce to power, right? They are grounded in empirical discoveries, and we need to kind of make sense on how their political functions interact with the material realities that they describe, right? And so I think for quite a bit of kind of late 20th century philosophy, we've been kind of stuck in a rather unhelpful divide, right? And I do think that that has opened up quite a bit in the past 20, 30 years, both on the continental side, with people discussing things like new materialism, for example, as well as on the analytic side, with kind of the stuff that we've been discussing in this workshop. And so I do think that also opens up new horizons of thinking about how the politics of concepts relates to their epistemic function, their scientific function, practice. Okay, I'm done. Just last final slide, kind of trying to bring home the main point that I wanted to bring home, right? So a lot of kind of my involvement recently in this debate about natural kinds has been, yes, should we use the concept or no? Should we not use the concept? I've been on the no camp. But trying to be constructive, I'm now also want to suggest maybe that's not actually the core issue, right? And maybe a lot of us actually kind of agree that the traditional way of natural kind, theorizing the divide in terms of essences, value, freedom, mind independence, does not work, right? And a lot of the debates that we're having right now are opening up a new horizon to think more complex and nuanced ways about the metaphysics, epistemology, and politics of scientific concepts. And I think for a philosopher that's kind of an exciting space to be in, because it also allows us to, I think, engage in much more fruitful and constructive ways with scientists and kind of co-produce better concepts for navigating the messy world. Thank you so much.